With the conclusion of YCS Niagara, we finally have a better idea of what this upcoming Rage of the Abyss format will look like, and in today's video I wanted to go over what I personally felt would be the most relevant or talked about decks post YCS Niagara, so you guys can have a better idea of how some of these decks will fare in the future. Of course, this is just my opinion and my opinion only, and plus I can't possibly cover every single relevant meta deck out there, so I tried to choose at least all the ones that were pretty relevant at Niagara, both from my own experience and from the ones that topped. Before we continue with the rest of the video, I wanted to give a huge thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Card Trader. Card Trader is an online marketplace for buying and selling singles, sealed product, and TCG supplies. Not only does it have a wide selection of cards from both older and newer sets, it's also very simple to use. You simply look up the cards you want, choose your preferred language and condition from a variety of sellers, and then add them to your cart. With this order I placed, I got cards from sellers in both Canada and Greece. However, by using Card Trader Zero, instead of paying shipping fees to multiple sellers, I had them all shipped out to me at once with only one fee. I also had extra peace of mind knowing that my cards were quality checked, since I knew I'd get exactly what I expected. And, as you can see, these cards are in the exact conditions that I ordered them in. If this sounds like something that could be useful to you, be sure to sign up for Card Trader today using my affiliate link in the description below. Don't forget to use code TCGSAM at checkout to also get 5% off your entire order. You'll get a nice discount while also helping to support the channel. Now, let's get back to the video. The first thing I want to talk about is Mulcharmy Fuwalos. This, of course, is going to be the meta-defining card that everyone is going to have to play around in this upcoming format, and a lot of the viability of these decks are going to be based around how well it can either play through this, around this, or whether it just doesn't care about it at all. With that being said, the first deck we're going to talk about is Yubel. I think that Yubel is still a very good deck. We can see that it's still made up a fair portion of top cut. It is, of course, I think a little bit worse into Mulcharmy Fuwalos than some of these other decks. Even though this deck is still very strong and puts up very powerful end boards, it's hindered a little bit by the fact that it doesn't have a great way to make like good half boards under a card like Mulcharmy Fuwalos like some of these other decks do. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in the strong meta contender, but I don't think it's the best deck of the format anymore. I think the best deck of the format goes to Azumina Snake Eyes, not by a long shot. I think there are definitely a lot of other decks that can compete with it, but I feel like this deck has a lot of strengths that some of these other decks don't have, including a very powerful engine that plays through hand traps well. It can put up fairly solid boards under Mulcharmy Fuwalos, especially if they included the Fire King engine in it. It basically gives the deck a few more options under the card, which I think is very good. It, of course, also has a lot of room for non-engine, which is important in this format, so I think all those factors just combined make it so Azumina Snake Eyes is probably the best deck of the format, and we can see that YCS Niagara, it did take up the majority of the top cut slots, but once again, I don't think this is going to be a tier 0 meta once again where like there's only like 2 viable decks. Next up is Centurion. Now, one Centurion deck did top, and I think that Centurion was a pretty good meta call on his part, because Centurion does play very well into 3 of the most powerful hand traps in this format, that being Shifter and both the Mulcharmies. The fact that this deck doesn't really care about any of them or can still set up almost their full end board through them is just kind of crazy, and the fact that it can play a bunch of non-engine as well, it made it a very strong meta call for YCS Niagara, and I think that's one of the reasons why it ended up topping. It also has access to one of the most powerful cards in the game right now, being Cosmic Blazar Dragon. This is probably the best Omni Negate still left in the game at the moment, and the fact that this deck can access multiple of it is kind of crazy. The only thing I would say about this deck is it's not super great into playing into hand traps. It can probably play through 1, maybe 2 maximum, but if your opponent's hitting you with cards like Mulcharmy and Shifter, like it plays through those like totally fine. So I think for that reason, it's probably at the bottom of strong meta contender. I would say that these other decks are better than it because they have a much higher ceiling, but that being said, Centurion's not a bad deck at all, and I think that it does have some unique strengths that some of these other decks just don't necessarily have. Next up is Tenpai Dragon. This was also a fairly highly represented deck in the top cut of Niagara, and I think this deck is still pretty good. This deck is crazy because it can play essentially 12 of the best hand traps in the game right now, it's being the 6 Mulcharmies plus Dominance, Impulse, and Shifter, and the fact that all of this can be played in this one deck is honestly insane. Not much to really say about this. Its spot hasn't really changed from last format. I don't think it'll ever be the best deck in the format, but it's definitely up there because of how oppressive its hand trap usage can be. Next up is Pure Fire King, and when I say pure, I mean like maybe the Azumina stuff in there, but not like a big Snake Eyes engine or anything like that. I think that Pure Fire King is a very strong deck. I think it's great into Molcharmi Fuelos. It doesn't play as hard into it as some of these other decks, but that being said though, it does lose a bit harder to a card like Molcharmi Purulia because of how many times it needs to summon from hand. Even that being said, I think that in terms of a deck, it puts up fairly strong end boards that have layered disruption, and I think that has a very good grind game as well, which I feel like puts it up there with some of these top meta contenders. I'd probably put it at the very top of high potential. I think that maybe something that holds it back is it doesn't have as many pushes as something like Azumina Snake Eyes would. Like maybe 1 or 2 hand traps will be enough to cut off this deck's turn, but once again, it's a very strong deck still, and I think that it definitely has the potential to be a very strong tier 1 deck. Next up is Rescue Ace or Rescue Ace Azumina. This deck is also very good. Its engine inherently is kind of big, so you don't have that much room for non-engine, but the engine itself is actually pretty good at going second. They have the built-in hand trap of Rescue Ace Impulse, which can get them into either more engine or just help them dig into their deck for more non-engine, as its end boards are still very strong. Back row is not something that most decks are super prepared for, and I think that having its disruptions in the back row as well as like some in the front makes it so it's pretty resilient to certain types of board breakers. Plus, it can take full advantage of all the fire support as well, and it doesn't necessarily lose very hard to Fuelos as well, because you can keep your combo very simple. Summon like Turbulence, resolve it, and then you kind of pass from there, and that's still pretty fine. Not to mention the few cards that summon from deck, like Emergency, can be chained to a card like Fuelos if your opponent decides to shotgun it. So I think I'd put it at top of high potential. Similar to Fire King, there's like a few things that hold it back. It does have very like clear choke points like this, whereas something like Azumina Snake Eyes doesn't necessarily have that weakness. That being said, very strong deck, and I feel like it definitely also has the potential to be a strong tier 1 deck in the future. Next up is Sky Striker, and Sky Striker did of course get second at YCS Niagara, but I personally feel like it is just worse Tenpai, and the reason it did so well is because the pilot was so good with the deck and was very experienced with it. But just in general, I feel like the Sky Striker engine at going second, you can argue it's just a little bit worse than Tenpai because it doesn't necessarily get to play those super high impact cards like Dimension Shifter, which Tenpai does have access to. Plus, not to mention, it doesn't necessarily also have all these ways to end the game quickly, so if you're not able to break their board with the board breakers, then you just kind of get ran over. Whereas with Tenpai, you can end the game very quickly or prevent your opponent from setting up a board with all those different possible hand traps. So I personally think that Sky Striker is rogue level, but if you're a super insane pilot, sure, you can definitely take this and compete at the highest level. Next up is Ritual Beast, and I think that Ritual Beast is a little bit worse positioned than it was in last format. This is a deck that is affected by both Molcharmis fairly hard, and while it does get the ability to play powerful cards like Dimension Shifter, I feel like its weakness to the Molcharmis will hold it back a tiny bit, so I don't think I can put it anything higher than high potential. Not to say it's a bad deck by any means, and not to say there aren't ways around like Molcharmi, especially Molcharmi Purulia, but I think a card like Fuelos just makes it so you can't do anywhere close to your full combo when you get hit with it, and you just have to settle for like a very meh, like okay end board. So I just put in the high potential tier for now. Next up is Runic Whitewoods, and I think that Runic Whitewoods is an okay deck. Like, nothing really changed for it. It doesn't necessarily play into Fuelos super well, because even though it isn't a super heavy combo deck, it does rely on summoning from the extra deck quite a few times just to establish their engine with cards like Diabells and the Synchro 6, which searches a light spellcaster. So I feel like its weakness to Fuelos is probably just going to hold it back a little bit. I probably have to put it at the top of Rogue tier. It's not a bad deck by any means, but I just feel like if everyone's playing a card that will just shut out your first turn, and you're just trying to play with like runic cards as disruption, I don't really think that's going to be necessarily enough in this upcoming format. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in the Rogue tier. Next up is Plants. I think that Plants also loses fairly hard to Molcharmi Fuelos, and to my knowledge, there isn't really a half board that you can make with it. So I think that this is pretty clearly just a Rogue deck now. Unless you're super experienced with the deck and have ways around it, I don't really think that this deck is going to be competing at the highest level, mainly due to its vulnerability to Molcharmi Fuelos. Next up is Kashtira. I think that this deck is fine. It is pretty resilient against a card like Molcharmi Fuelos. You don't have to summon from your extra deck at all. At most, you would summon from your main deck once with a card like Theosis, and that's not too bad. You can play Dimension Shifter as well, which is really nice, but I think that the problem with Kashtira has always just been its consistency, and while playing the Molcharmies can fix that a little bit, that is a pretty big problem for a deck to have, and especially if you're playing these long events. I feel like you want your engine to be as consistent as possible, and I just feel like Kashtira will just brick a few too many times in a big tournament. So I probably put it like top of Rogue tier. I would say it's a little bit better than all these decks, but overall I feel like it doesn't really belong anywhere higher than the Rogue tier. It would just be more of a specific meta call at a certain tournament. Next up is Millennium. I think that even though one Millennium topped, I'm not too sure how good this deck is. I played against it a few times myself, and I was never really super impressed with what it did. One thing I guess it does have going for it is it doesn't really lose to any of the top hand traps. So if you get shifted, you can still sort of do a similar thing as you normally would anyways, because you're just summoning the big Exodia fusion. You get hit with either Molcharmy, you're not really giving them many draws at all. I don't think Perulia would ever hit them. And I think Molcharmy Fuelos is just drawing one card maximum against them. So that's something nice it has going for it. I feel like its end board is pretty much just capped at the Exodia fusion plus whatever you're setting. And while that isn't terrible, the fact that your ceiling is so low just makes it so you're going to get run over by a lot of these top decks unless you see one of those big blowouts like Shifter in your turn. So I'm going to have to put this like in the middle of Rogue tier. I could be completely wrong on this, but at least from my experience, that's all the deck really does. Not to mention you have to play 5 bricks in your deck, which is never really a thing you want to be doing. Next up is Labyrinth. I think that Labyrinth is also fairly well positioned this format. Doesn't really care about any of the top 3 hand traps. It is hurt quite a bit by Dominus Impulse because the main way you get into Engine is through the Welcome Labyrinth trap cards, but outside of that, it did get top 4 at ICS Niagara, and I think for good reason. It is able to play around these very popular hand traps well, and you're just able to essentially tailor your deck with the specific traps that would hit the top decks in a certain meta, meaning that this deck is always adaptable and should always give you a good matchup into whatever field you may be expecting, just because the wide pool of trap cards that are available to this deck. So I think that it has pretty high potential. I feel like it's in a better spot now than it was in a previous format. Next up is Melodious. I think that Melodious does struggle against both the Molcharmies plus Shifter, and its end boards, while they're fine and the deck can be resilient to like other hand traps that aren't these, I just feel like there isn't that much going for Melodious this format, and I'd probably just choose to play a different deck if you want something more mid-rangey that just has better options into cards like Molcharmy Fuelos. Next up is Salamangreat, and I think this is just an example of a deck I chose that suffers really hard from the existence of Fuelos. I just don't think that this deck can be that competitive with the existence of this card, and it wasn't even that great beforehand, so I'm just have to put it in the bad tier. Unfortunately, it doesn't really have any unique strengths that would set it apart from any of these top other decks that would give it an edge against them or something like that. Next up is Tearlament, and I think that Tearlament also falls in a similar category as Salamangreat, and its engine can be quite strong and going second even without seeing any non-engine. I just feel like its vulnerability to all those top hand traps that everyone's playing just makes it so it can't really be anything higher than Rogue in my opinion. It's a cool deck, but I just don't see how it's going to be able to consistently play through a card like Fuelos without significantly hindering their end board. Next up is Chimera. I think that Chimera is a pretty solid deck. It has okay lines, I think, into both Molcharmies. You don't necessarily have to go ham on your first turn because you do have the ability to play on your opponent's turn with cards like Chimera Fusion. But I do feel like the existence of Molcharmy Fuelos and Perulia do make it so your first turn board is going to be severely hindered most of the time, and I think that's where most of the strength in the deck came from, was its first turn boards with the Fiendsmith cards. But the Fiendsmith cards just losing to Shifter and Fuelos makes it so you can't really do those plays all the time in the deck, so I think it's probably just going to go to like maybe bottom of high potential. I don't want to necessarily write this deck off as Rogue yet. It does have quite a strong engine and it can still put up some pretty strong boards, but it is pretty vulnerable to the Molcharmies and Shifter. Next up is Voiceless Voice, and Voiceless Voice plays very well into the two Molcharmies and into Shifter, but I feel like its ceiling is just too low. It's a similar problem as Kashtira, I feel like. Yes, you're never really losing to these hand traps, but your own engine is just going to get run over by every top deck out there unless you pair it with something unfair like a Floodgate. So in Kashtira's case, that was Shifter. In Voiceless Voice's case, I guess that would just be a bunch of hand traps. It just doesn't do enough in my opinion. Next up is Mermail. And Mermail is one of those decks I saw at Niagara do somewhat okay. I saw a few in day 2, some bubbled out, I believe. But I feel like the biggest problem with this deck is it is incredibly vulnerable, I think, to the Shifter and the 2 Mulcharmies. Not to mention it doesn't get the opportunity to play many non-engine cards as well, meaning most of the time it's relying on its own engine to break boards. And while that's certainly not impossible, since its engine can be pretty good into that, I feel like to do well with this deck requires you to essentially dodge all those silver bullets like the Mulcharmies and Shifter and be winning a lot of your die rolls. So I think that kind of deck probably just goes into the rogue tier. I don't think it's a bad deck per se because it is very strong going first and does put up boards that are pretty much unbeatable. But that being said, I think there are just too many cards in this format that hinder this deck, and unfortunately I don't think I can put it any higher than rogue. Next up is Floowandereeze. I personally don't think it's a very good deck, but every time I say that, I end up losing to it in a big tournament somehow. But putting my own personal experience behind me, I think objectively Floowandereeze is a very okay deck. It's definitely just a rogue deck at this point. You can play Shifter, which is cool. You don't care about Fuulos at all, but you get hard cooked by Purrlia, which most decks are still choosing this side. So I think that even though it's only vulnerable to Purrlia, it does have other problems as well, like bricking, meaning I don't think it's very competitive and probably won't go any higher than the rogue tier. Next up is Purrely, and I think that Purrely is like okay into a card like Shifter. It can be fine into, I think it's pretty good into Mulcharmie Purrlia as well, but Fuulos can be something that hurts because most of your starters will summon from the deck. And if you end up choosing not to summon from the deck when your opponent chains Fuulos, for example, to a quick play spell, you're going to end up losing quite a bit of card advantage. I think that this deck is almost like a coin flip into Fuulos. Sometimes you'll have hands which I feel like play into Fuulos fine, like you'll activate like a quick play spell. Your opponent will chain Fuulos, you can just choose not to summon from deck, normal summon something like Purrely, and then XYZ into something there, and I think that could be okay since that still gets you to your end board piece in Noir. But then there are also other hands where you don't really have a choice but to summon multiple times from your deck and from your extra deck, meaning I think that this deck is probably like maybe top of rogue tier. Next up is Sprite, and I think that Sprite is in a similar boat as Melodious and Salamangreat. It does do a little bit better of a job setting up like half wars because you do have access to cards like Red and Carrot, which just are inherently negations that you could summon without having to commit hard into Fuulos. But outside of that, I feel like this deck is also just a combo deck that suffers very hard from both the Mulcharmies. So I think I probably have to just put it like with these other decks as well. I don't think it's super great at the moment. And I feel like you just rather play any other combo deck that has a better chance into these popular hand traps. That being said, however, you could choose to maybe play a Shifter Sprite version, and that could be fine, but I think they're just better Shifter decks as well. Next up is Branded, and Branded I think is a little bit worse than it was last format because of the existence of Dominus Impulse. Not to mention it also does get cooked fairly often by all 3 of the top hand traps, and while yes it does do some very unfair things and can play through normal hand traps fine, I just feel like with the addition of Dominus Impulse now, people now have 3 more ways to stop the best card in your deck, and I think that's going to hinder Branded quite a bit. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in the rogue tier. I'm not saying it's a bad deck by any means, but I think that there are just too many cards in this format that do too much to it, especially also because people are siding cards like Dimensional Barrier to hit Tenpai Dragons. This deck just kind of gets caught in the crossfire. Next up is Runic Stun, and I think that Runic Stun is in a fine place. It's always been like that, where obviously it doesn't care about hand traps that people are playing, but then again, is it good enough to like slow down these other decks to where it can successfully deck them out? There are still some pretty solid floodgates this format. It can play a card like Deck Lockdown theoretically, which is pretty good. It does hit a lot of these top decks in the format. So I think it probably just be a high potential deck. I think that's all it'll ever be. It's just this very specific meta call, and there are going to be tournaments where it's very good because people are expecting like 1 or 2 decks to be the best decks, and this deck can be tailor-made to beat them. But on the other hand, I just feel like as long as people sort of respect the deck, they're always going to play outs in their side deck through cards like Cosmic Cyclone or something like that. And then finally we have Memento. I think that Memento unfortunately loses to all of the 3 hand traps that I previously mentioned. I don't think it can put up a half board that's super great under Fuulos. At least that's what I can tell from my experience with the deck. So while it does have some very strong end boards and can play through the other hand traps fine, I just feel like it isn't going to be that good this format, and I think that it's just going to end up being a rogue deck overall. So it's going to be in a similar boat as some of these other decks. It's great when it doesn't see these cards, but when these cards are dropped against you, it doesn't really have a great plan B. So with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. Let me know if you agree, disagree. If you think I missed any super relevant decks, do let me know as well. And once again, just remember, this is based off of one tournament and my own experience so far with the format, so this can all change in the upcoming weeks as people find more text or things like that, so do keep that in mind. But with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.